Welcome to my comprehensive guide on spawning and raising celestial pearl Danios. If you're looking for information on a specific part of this process, I encourage the use of timestamps that I've included in the video description below. This video might be long, but if you have little or no experience with breeding this fish, I recommend watching it in its entirety. I've done my best to ensure that every moment is informative. We'll begin with basic tank setup. An aquarium of at least 10 gallons would be ideal to help keep stable water chemistry, but this could be done in as small as a 5-gallon. Just be careful and attentive to the water quality. In my experience, substrate color and texture are not significantly impactful to this breeding process. Even a bare-bottom tank would likely work, but you might consider painting the underside of the tank black so that your fish aren't living above a mirror. If you're setting up a new tank just for breeding, be cautious of using aquasoil substrates that might, in the early days of the tank, release excessive nutrients and buffer your water to a low pH. CPDs don't require special water conditions outside of their normal care in order to breed. Water temperature should be in the low to mid-70s, pH should be neutral plus or minus about 0.4, and the water should of course be clean and free of ammonia, nitrites, or nitrates above 40 parts per million. In general, fish don't enjoy bright lights. If you're using LED plant lights, you should probably keep them dim at least for the first few hours that they're on so that the fish feel comfortable coming out into the open and hanging out around your spawning site. I've heard it said that CPD are first light spawners, and I believe that to be true only to the extent that they don't breed in the dark. When your lights come on, they will start spawning and will continue to spawn throughout the day. To increase the comfort level of your fish and to help keep the water clean, it can be very helpful to keep live plants. In this case, though, you want to make sure that you don't include live plants that would create an attractive spawning site. We want them to lay eggs in one place where we can retrieve and remove them. That's called an egg trap, and we'll get to that later. If you want to include live plants, and you should, floating plants would be ideal. Having some utility tank mates can be helpful for cleaning up uneaten food, and as long as they aren't large and aggressive enough to stress your fish, they shouldn't interfere with the spawning process. I have several pest snails, a small hillstream loach, and 2 amano shrimp living in my breeding tank and have had no issues with them eating eggs. Just make sure that any other animals you keep in this tank are also fed and cared for. When spawning in groups, a ratio of 1 male to 2 females should be very effective. Having a larger number of females will provide more eggs in a single day and will diffuse the male's aggressive breeding behavior. A single male and female pair can definitely produce viable eggs, but the female could easily become stressed out as she is pursued relentlessly around the tank by a male wanting to breed. The group I use for breeding is a total of 6 fish, 2 males and 4 females. If I wanted to maximize egg production in a single day, I would probably split them into 2 groups of 1 male and 2 females. In my opinion, the males spend so much time chasing each other away from the females and the spawning site that they waste a lot of time that could be spent spawning. To provide the females with enough nutrition to grow a large supply of eggs, it's important to feed them a high-quality diet rich in protein. In my opinion, there is no substitute here for live baby brine shrimp. They are easy to produce, and within a week or 2, will have your females looking like fat little whales. If you can't or don't want to hatch brine shrimp, the next best options would be frozen live foods and then a very high-quality dry food. It is still possible to spawn CPD having only been fed dry food, but the females won't build up nearly as large a reserve of eggs. Given how useful live baby brine shrimp will be for feeding the fry, I strongly suggest learning to hatch them. If you've never done it before, check my channel for a video on how to hatch them on a daily basis. A short deli cup or Tupperware will work well as an egg trap, and screens aren't necessary. I used to lean heavily toward using mosses, but I've learned that CPD really aren't that picky as long as they actually want to breed. If you have moss or sesquitertang available, they will both work well, but aren't strictly necessary. Any soft, leafy green plant can be trimmed and placed into the container to attract your fish. I'll show you how to make one out of water sprite, which is easy to find and easy to grow. So I have moss, I have sesquitertang, but just to prove that it can be done, I'm going to make the fry trap out of water sprite. Just need something leafy and green. I might have to cut this up, I might not. Let's see how long it is. I don't think so. So I just pulled these out of another tank, gave them a rinse so they're not bringing anything dirty with them, and that ought to be fine. Okay, a little bunch like this. Just wrap them up at the base with a plant weight. Okay, and lay them in the cup. This will work just fine. Kind of keep the vegetation up near the top so they can see it from over the edge. And this is ready to place in the tank. Watch your fish for a few days and learn which portions of the tank they feel most comfortable. Place the egg trap close to an area where they often take shelter. In my case, that's near a sponge filter that they often hide under. Try to make sure that some of the vegetation is visible above or near the top of your container. Give the fish a day to explore your egg trap and identify it as a spawning site. You should quickly see the males guiding females into the trap to spawn. Remove and check the trap each day at least 4 to 6 hours after your lights come on. So here we are, a day after placing the egg trap. I'm just going to remove and kind of shake vegetation in case there's any eggs stuck on it. Set that off to the side. Take that extra weight out of there. I'm going to get some magnification here and see if I can show you how to identify fertile versus infertile eggs. So the eggs are pretty clearly visible even without magnification, but I really wanted to zoom in and show an example of what they look like up close. And fortunately for the fish, but unfortunately for us, I can't show you a single example of one that is clearly infertile here. These are all looking pretty good. What you would be looking for, though, is for the eggs to be opaque and white and looking for any fuzzy white fungal growth. Now, there's always a possibility that over the next hours to a day, some could break down and display that they are infertile, but for now, we just have a bunch of great examples of fertile eggs. So while we're looking at them so close, I'll show you how easy it is to move them gently. I have a pipette here with the very tip cut off, so it's got a bit wider opening. And if you just bring that close to the eggs, compress it and gently relieve that pressure, you can move them pretty easily. So this would be a great way to grab and remove any infertile eggs, or just to pull these out of here without grabbing all that junk from the tank and bringing it with you. So I think what I'm going to do is float this container in the tank for a little while, maybe the rest of the day, maybe check them later on or tomorrow and see if any of them show signs of infertility so I can show you a better example. So we'll resume then. So we're back the next day, and here is an example of an egg that is still fertile, and you can tell it's developing because the yolk on the inside is starting to take on a very slightly yellow-brown color. And as the egg continues to grow, that should just intensify until you see little black dots that would be the eyes of the fry inside. Now I'm going to show you some that have become infertile and fungusy. Now on the far left, you can see that there's still one fertile egg in this group, but the rest have turned distinctly white, and you can see the fuzzy white growth of fungus on the outside. Now when you're watching your own eggs, you want to be looking for this change and removing those eggs as quickly as possible. It's likely that only 1 or 2 of these were actually infertile and started a fungal growth, but the fungus spread to the others. So when you are collecting your eggs and placing them, you need to make sure that if you're not using an additive that stops fungal growth like methylene blue, you want to get your eggs spread out so that if 1 or 2 start to decay, you can remove them before it has time to spread to your other fertile eggs and destroy them. Once you've removed any infertile eggs, the remainder can be floated in a small container or placed directly into a breeding box while they hatch. In order to raise the fry, they need to be kept in a small area where they can easily be fed. Fry left to hatch with the adults will almost certainly be eaten, and even if kept alone, if it's in a large area, they won't be able to find enough food unless we're talking about a very small number of fry in a densely planted tank. Be sure to spread the eggs apart from each other and continue to watch for and remove any eggs that turn white or grow fungus. Depending on your temperature, your eggs should take 3 to 5 days to hatch. Only attempt to raise fry from eggs that were laid within a few days of each other so that there won't be a large variation in age and size. Feeding will become much more difficult if you have to feed different foods for different sizes of fry at the same time. Fry can be raised in something as simple as a floating Tupperware, but I highly recommend keeping them in some kind of breeding enclosure that circulates fresh water and allows you to view the fry from the side so that you can see how full their stomachs are and also how clean the enclosure is. I recommend using a hang-on tank breeding box or a German breeder ring. I haven't used a Zis breeder box yet, but if it satisfies these criteria, it should be fine. I would avoid using a loose, net-based fry enclosure because the porousness of the net is likely to trap food and also doesn't offer a good view of the fry from the side. I'll show you briefly the enclosure that I use. So here's how I have a breeding box set up, and there's a few important modifications here that I would recommend. Now the first is not absolutely necessary, this is just what I'm choosing to do. I am not using an air-driven uplift tube to bring new water into here. I actually have a sponge filter in the back of this 10-gallon here connected to a power head, and this power head has one of those airline connections coming out the top, and I've mostly stopped the flow out of the front of the power head and then connected some silicone tubing to the airline connection, and you can see at that point it just pumps water. Not a ton, but a really good amount for keeping this water fresh. I took a small square of foam. It's hard to see, but I cut out a little circle in one end of it that fits over this elbow here that came with the breeding box. And what that does is it baffles the water flow and allows me to move a lot of water through here without creating a tornado inside the breeding box. The fry would not like that very much. And I just use the included clip on that elbow to keep this in place. And this is a nice gentle flow. Another very important part here is that the plastic gate that comes with these breeding boxes to guard the overflow is not nearly fine enough to keep these tiny fry from escaping. And so what I've done is taken a square of some fine foam and cut it to the shape of the overflow. I have it wedged in there. Now, I had some trouble in the beginning with this, what I thought was clogging, which would have the water level raised dangerously high to the point where I could have overflows. It'll overflow here first, but of course I'm paranoid about it overflowing over the sides and making a mess. I also don't want to lose the fry, but I think I figured out how to make this work. The problem is not that it becomes clogged very, very quickly. The problem is surface tension, the cohesive properties of water. What you have to do to make sure that water can flow through here is get this wet. If this is dry, the water is going to raise way up to the edge here before pressure pushes it through the foam. So when you're first setting this up, if you just take your block of foam and get it wet, soak up some water, then place it here, water will flow through just fine. I only have to stop and clean this out maybe once a week. It's not a significant problem. After hatching, the fry will spend their first 3 to 5 days lying motionless on the bottom or clinging to the side of their enclosure. During this time, they live off the nutrients in the remaining egg sac and don't require food. Any attempts at feeding before the fry are free swimming will only serve to foul the water and culture bacteria that could pose a risk of infection. If, after several days, you get concerned that a motionless fry is dead, you can use a pipette to gently puff water on them, and if they're alive, they'll move. I should say, though, that it's pretty easy to spot a dead fry. Their bodies and eyes turn distinctly white. As soon as the fry become free swimming, they will need to be fed 3 or more times per day. At this size, ideal foods include fry powders and paramecium. You can feed your fry using a finely crushed up flake or pellet food, but I highly recommend getting a powder. Even using a mortar and pestle, your homemade powder might still be too large for them to eat. For a fry powder, I recommend New Life Spectrum's Grow Fry Powder, and I'll show you how to use a powder because CPD fry make it somewhat difficult. So the tricky thing about feeding fry powder to CPD fry is that they like to eat just like they're adults, right out of the middle of the water column. They don't really like to eat off the top or the bottom, and fry powder, if just applied to the top, it just sits on the top. And it might float, it might sink, most of it's probably going to float, but you're not going to be able to effectively get enough right in front of them. Probably most of it is just going to stay up here and then maybe collect around the sides. There's a lot of waste there. The easiest solution I've found so far is to just get some fry powder on the tip of my finger and just kind of tap it on top of the water. You can see that little plume of it coming down. I always make sure my hands are clean before I do this, and I rinse them with a lot of water, but no soap, because we don't want soap getting in here. This'll work. It might be a tad messy, but it does work. So here's another method I've been experimenting with and kind of like for getting the fry powder into the water where your fry are gonna eat it. You just mix it in with some water and then grab it with a pipette. You can kind of inject it right in front of their face. Now, I don't have any freshly hatched CPD fry right now, but I am using it for rams. I'll show you that. And the parents are going to try and kill me when I do this, but I just want to show you what it looks like. Just using a pipette to bring it right to the fry. And this seems to work pretty well. The best live food option at this stage would be cultured paramecium. I worry that as much as people reference infusoria as a fry food, some might get the impression that you can just throw a clump of moss in with your fry and expect it to keep them fed. That just won't cut it. Try feeding them a dense cup of paramecium and watch how quickly your fry consume them. That will give you a good idea of how insufficient the microorganisms growing on some moss will be. If you've never cultured paramecium, check my channel for a video on how to do so. After a week or so, the fry should have at least doubled in size. You should see a small tail fin developing, and the head and stomach should be larger. At this point, you can continue to feed a fry powder and paramecium, but you can also introduce vinegar eels. They're a little larger and more substantial than the paramecium, but a whole lot easier to culture reliably. Once again, if you've never used vinegar eels, check my channel for a video on how to culture them. And by the way, if all this talk of live food culture scares you, don't worry. It's definitely possible to get them large enough to eat baby brine shrimp using only a fry powder. It's just a little messy and will require a lot of cleaning up after. Somewhere around the 2 to 3 week mark, your fry should be large enough to start introducing live baby brine shrimp. This is the live food portion of raising CPD fry that you really don't have a good alternative to. At least I haven't found one that I feel I can rely on. Start by introducing a few freshly hatched brine shrimp to your fry and see whether their mouths have gotten large enough to eat them. The way baby brine shrimp move about in the water, you should be able to observe your fry eating them within moments. If they bite them but don't swallow them, they may still be too small. It should be easy to tell afterwards if your fry have eaten baby brine shrimp because their stomachs will be full and distinctly orange or pink in color. If some fry are able to eat baby brine shrimp but others are still too small, continue to feed whatever smaller foods you were using before and wait until all fry are large enough before discontinuing the use of those foods. Once your fry are consistently eating baby brine shrimp, it might be useful to place a small light source above your enclosure to attract the shrimp toward the upper water column where they will be easier for your fry to locate. Raising your CPD fry really comes down to a balance between two factors. First, shoving as much food into their tiny faces as you can manage, and second, keeping any excess food from fouling the water or growing bacteria that could potentially infect and kill your fry. To ensure that all of your fry get enough to eat, there will almost always be a surplus of food. To that end, it's crucial that you remove uneaten food on a regular basis. I'll show you a few ways I keep my enclosures clean. I'm going to show you here a few examples of how to clean your enclosure. And I'm just going to use this breeding box. So your water surface will occasionally get dirty with this oily, dusty film on top. And you want to get rid of that if it ever gets too thick because it'll actually restrict your fry's access to the water surface. And that can give them trouble with keeping their swim bladders inflated. So what you want is some kind of a little container you can dip in there, preferably with a little mouth to it. That makes this a lot easier. And you just dip the cup in there and let the surface tension break on one side. And if you hold your little cup mostly vertical, this will just skim anything off the top of the water for you. You can kind of move it around if you see that you've removed all in one area and you want to get some from the other side. Just move slow so you don't bang into any of the fry. Obviously, if you grab one in here, you might just have to dump it out and start over. But this is pretty easy, and I only find myself having to do this once every several days maybe. And when you're done, you can just dump it. Next, we're going to clean the bottom. Now, whatever kind of food you're using, whether that be a fry powder or later on maybe the baby brine shrimp, you're going to have some collecting on the bottom, and you don't want extra food to sit down there. Especially at night, your fish might go to sleep and sit kind of low in here, and having rotting food around them poses a great risk of giving them a bacterial infection. So you'll often hear people discuss removing uneaten food after feeding with a pipette, and that is just going to take you forever. And if it takes too long, you won't keep up on it, and this process will fail. So what I do is I use a section of rigid tubing connected to some flexible tubing, and I use this as a small, very precise siphon, and I've got a bucket down below me that I'm going to siphon into. And what I do after I get the siphon started is I keep a finger on the end of the tube down in the bucket, so that if I feel like I've gotten too close to a fry, I can stop the water flow and not suck them up. If you do happen to grab one, just make sure the container you're draining into is clean, so that if you have to remove one from it, you can. And also, if you notice that you sucked one up right afterwards, just stop the flow, take your other end and raise the tube above the level of your enclosure, and you can easily let him fall back out of the tube. So I'm going to start the siphon right now. And what we're going to do is very carefully, with the tip of the rigid tubing just 1/8 of an inch or so off the bottom, we're just going to move around and carefully remove anything that's collected on the bottom. I'm getting baby brine shrimp right now, and they kind of like to hang out over here because they're attracted to the light coming from the tank behind this. And to avoid grabbing any fry, what I do if they get close to me is, of course, I'll stop the siphon with my finger, but just kind of wave the tube around and scare them away. That helps you get through this more quickly. And just move around the whole bottom, pick everything up. You'll notice that the water level is dropping a little bit. And when it does, it kind of gives you a perfect opportunity to take a paper towel or something and clean up some of the scum that's collecting up here. But all in all, this doesn't take long. There we go. Let that all drain out. While you're doing this, you might want to remove your water supply so that you can control the water level for cleaning. Yeah, you can just take a towel and clean up around this edge here. If you're using foam to keep the fry from escaping through the overflow, this would be a perfect time to take this and squeeze it out and rinse it in your wastewater. They do tend to get plugged up with debris after a while, and I haven't had any overflow issues since I figured out how to make this foam work, but today the water level was looking about a 1/2 inch higher, so I think it's a good time to clean it. And there you go. It's probably a once-a-day process. There's one final note I want to discuss about keeping these enclosures clean. Now, no matter how good a job you do of siphoning junk off the bottom and skimming the top, wiping down the sides, no matter what, eventually the inside of these things are going to get kind of scummy. And again, that's going to pose a great risk of infection. So there may come a time when you want to very gently transfer the fry out of here. And it's very convenient that these have corner edges, because you can carefully pour them out into another clean container while you rinse, clean, and sterilize this breeding box. In my case, I happen to have a few of these, so I just had a clean one ready, transferred them into it, and I can now clean the dirty one that they came from. It's kind of a nuclear option, but with the length of time that they might spend in here, it's definitely on the table. So how many fry should you attempt to raise in a single enclosure like this? That's kind of a complicated question, and there's a lot of variables to it. But I can tell you that this enclosure right here, I tried to count and it's a little tough, but there's somewhere between 40 and 50 in here. I have had more fatalities in this container than I did with a much smaller group of about 14 in a German breeding ring, which is, I would say, most of this same water volume. But my observation over time has been that there is just something not good about high density. If you think about how livestock are raised in general, there's a lot of antibiotics used when they're kept in high density, close proximity, just because if anything happens to one, it's very likely that it's going to spread to the others. So I think a good target, if you're using a breeding box like this, I think somewhere between 20 and 30 would probably be comfortable. I'm obviously exceeding that, but I'm pretty good about maintenance, and I'm also running an ultraviolet sterilizer in the tank that this is connected to, and I'm hoping that that's going to buy me some leeway to have a few more in here. If you do want to go gangbusters with quantity, I suppose you could just get another breeding box and attach it to the same tank, and that might let you get away with having a few more raising up at once, because it really does not seem to me to be about the volume of water that the breeding box is attached to. Now, 10 gallons I think is great, 5 might be a little shy, but it wouldn't matter, I don't think, if this was connected to 100 gallons of water. It's all about the bacterial load inside of their enclosure, their immediate surroundings. As long as you're using a reasonable volume of water for the tank behind it, I think you could easily double this amount I have here in another box, and then it would just come down to water changes. But so far, my observation has been that at this stage of life, the overall load of nitrates being produced is pretty low. So yeah, keep up on water changes. You could probably do quite a few more. So there are a few things you want to look out for in the fry themselves that might be an indicator that you're in for trouble. First of all, any growths, white growths on the fish might be fungal, might be bacterial. That's a really bad sign. The other one that I've seen most frequently is that the fish seems to be having trouble with buoyancy. If you see it kind of tilting backwards and seeming like it's struggling to maintain its position in the water column, like it's always struggling to go upwards and falling downwards, I would say, unfortunately, that fish is probably a goner and you might want to remove it. I haven't seen them recover from that. Otherwise, I haven't observed any common health issues at this stage of life. Once your fry are large enough to eat baby brine shrimp, it's really just a game of rinse and repeat. Keep feeding a few times a day, keep cleaning their enclosure, and wait. Watch the fry, monitor water quality, and do partial water changes as necessary. Any precautions you might take to prevent temperature shock during a water change should be intensified to avoid harming these small sensitive fish. Any attempts to move or relocate your fry from their rearing enclosure should be made gently with a cup or a turkey baster. Trying to net them at this size will likely kill them. These fry are just over 2 months old, and even though they're starting to look like fish, they aren't nearly ready to be released into a larger space. I'll keep them growing in here until I'm confident that they're large enough and strong enough to be able to track down food in a tank of their own. That's all I have for now, and once again I hope that the information I've provided here can be of some use to you, and as always, thanks for watching. Bye.